make me feel. I'm an alien from outer space. I'm a cyber girl without a face, a heart or a mind. I'm a product of the I'm a slave girl without a race. On the run 'cause they hit to erase and chase out my kind. Come to destroy me. Come to destroy me. And I think to myself, wait, it's impossible. Never gonna know me. And they're after you. And all the sirens go doo-doo. Oh, baby, ooh, you know the rules. I love you, and I won't take no for an answer. They say that violet stars will set you free when you're running lost and alone up Neon Valley Street. A pretty day makes a pretty picture, but fall in love and they coming to get ya.
Elena, I'm digging the music.
Shalika's
Nice.
It's impossible that they're gonna
Shalika, great music.
Y'all better shut up.
Kamal, you're spotlighted.
Oh, hi, everyone, and welcome to the final keynote of the speaker series, Who Cares? Sustaining Relations of Health Beyond Times of Crisis. My name is Komolaf, and I will be moderating this event alongside Shalika Savatasan. Before we get started, I have a few notes for audience participation. If you have any questions, you can ask them during the Q&A session at the end, or you can leave them in the chat on Zoom or YouTube, where this event is being live streamed and recorded for later viewing. A note that this event will have subtitles. You can also directly send myself or Shalika a private message if you would like us to ask on your behalf. And finally, be sure to keep your microphones on mute throughout the event. With that, I will pass things off to Roberta.
Hi, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me because I've been having some issues with sound. Yeah, I would like to welcome you all, and I would like to do the land acknowledgement. So I'm joining you today from Toronto, and I understand that our two guests are coming from two completely different places across the world, literally. I'm a migrant and settler in this city. This area is the ancestral and traditional territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the original custodians of the land on which we stand and create. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon, One Spoon Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nation to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. It is important to acknowledge the profound symbolism of the one dish and one spoon at the heart of this covenant, if we are to honor what it asks of us going forward. One dish and one spoon indicate that we each partake of the abundance of the land with the responsibility towards sharing it with others in a manner that is full of respect and care. To eat from one dish with one spoon entails deep responsibility, respect, and care. Responsibility, respect, and care towards taking just enough from the plate and ensuring that there is enough for others. Although we may be meeting on a virtual platform today, this does not mean that our meeting is placeless. In the midst of the winds of war now blowing again from Europe and in other parts of the world, because let's face it, there's been a lot of war going on in other parts of the world until very recently. I encourage each and every one of us meeting here today to reflect on the complex webs of interdependence that sustain us. Starting from the lands we find ourselves working on and in, and from the deep ethics of relation and reciprocity that the covenants of its original peoples remind us of. My name is Roberta Bujani, and I'm a faculty both at the University of Toronto and at York University, which are two of the institutions that are involved. The third institution that is involved in this series is the Fields Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences. I'm also the artistic director of the Arts High Salon, which is a collective committed to fostering collaborations between the arts and technoscience, based at the Fields Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences. And I think Elena would like to introduce herself right now.
Good evening, everyone, and I am Elena Basile. I'm the co-organizer of the Who Cares Speaker Series. I also teach at the University of Toronto in the Sexual Diversity Studies program, and at York University in the departments of English, in the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and in the Master's Program in Translation Studies at York. Together, we have created this speaker series, the Who Cares Speaker Series, to foster transdisciplinary conversations between doctors, writers, artists, and researchers at different points of their careers on contemporary biopolitics of care, most of all to address the urgent need to move towards more respectful, creative, and inclusive social practices of care in the wake of the systemic cracks that have been made more than obvious by the pandemic. This is our series keynote conversation, and it happens at the end of 4 incredibly stimulating weeks of roundtables and workshops. And if you missed the previous events, recordings can be found on our YouTube channel or on the Who Cares website under the corresponding page. So even this event here will be recorded and then added to the program in our webpage. We are also concurrently hosting 2 exhibitions by 2 artists engaging with issues specifically of cancer care, literacy, and healing. They are Alana Kibbe's Transform, Exploring the Languages of Healing, which actually opened last night at the Canadian Language Museum and the Glendon College campus at York University, and will stay open until the end of April. And we have a second exhibition coming up, an opening coming up next Thursday by Camille Baker, who is an immersive media artist, and she has an immersive installation called Inter Her. And that opens on Thursday, April 7th at 5 p.m. In the DG Ivy Library in New College at University of Toronto. So we've been lucky enough for both these events to actually be in person. And this installation will also be open until the very end of April too. And finally, next Friday, April 8th, from 4 to 6 p.m., artist Carolina Ziniewicz, that's another difficult one to pronounce, will give the series closing artist talk titled Signs of Time, Collecting Biological Traces and Memories. This will also be followed by a performative intervention on Saturday, April 9 at 2 p.m., also in the Ivy Library at New College. I'll let Roberta say the words of thanks and acknowledgement to the many supporters that have made this this long speaker series possible.
And yes, so as I mentioned before, this is an event that, a series of events that has seen many people supporting us. And without their support, we would have actually not been able to actually do it. First of all, I want to thank SHURC, which is the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, for just kickstarting us. But also I'm very grateful for our 3 institutions, as I said before, York University, New College at the University of Toronto, and the Fields Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences. We also wish to acknowledge the generous contribution of the Center for Feminist Research, Sensorium Center for Digital Arts and Technology, the Canadian Language Museum, the Department of English, and the School of Gender and Women's Studies at York University, and then the DG Ivy Library and the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. This is also an event that is co-produced by Outside Salon, which is the organization that I'm running. And I also would like to thank the very dedicated work that all of our students, workers have done throughout this series. We have 2 of them today, Shalika and Kamal, but then we've had many others in the past, a few roundtables and keynotes. And I'm not going to name them all, but if you want to take a look, we took pictures of them, and they are all in our website under the team. So you'll see them in their splendor. So without further ado, I will give it to Elena to introduce this event.
Thank you very much, Roberta. I very much appreciate. And I'm just going to give a very general introduction to the event at large, and then I'll leave it to Professor Alexander Gorson to introduce Bayo, and then Seema, who will then talk after Bayo. So throughout the speaker series, we've listed the voices of doctors, thinkers, and artists, all calling for the need not only to examine the terrible distortions and shortfalls of our systems, but also to start building different approaches to care at large. The arts and artistic research in general play a crucial role in such a project of change, as they provide tools for bearing witness to the present and for educating our imaginations towards different horizons of the possible. A generous and provocative thinker of fugitive decoloniality, Bayo Akomolafe, and a doctor, journalist, poet, and fierce anti-racist public health advocate, Seema Yasmin, each of our guests tonight invites us to engage with the unsettling dimensions of viruses and epidemics. And they do so by means of encouraging awareness of their deep entanglements with civilizational responses, biomedical, journalistic, legal, political responses, cultural responses at large, that continue to be rigidly beholden to the strictures and the structures of anthropocentric colonial patriarchy, aka modernity. I came across the work of Bayo Akomolafe during the first pandemic lockdown in spring 2020. His speculative fabulation, I, coronavirus, mother, monster, activist, became my immediate go-to text to think through what was unfolding then and continues to unfold now in the wake of the pandemic. And before that, possibly in the wake of the hold, as I've seen Bayo examine. Similarly, when Roberta gifted me Seema Yasmin's poetry collection here, If God is a Virus, last spring, I read it also as a fierce exploration of the manifold dimensions of epidemics and how they tend to amplify the worst colonial, racist, and heteropatriarchal patterns of information and healthcare delivery. For 2 years now, I have asked both myself and my students to sit with Akomolafe's invitation to, and I'm quoting him, meet ourselves via the transversal disruptions brought about by this visitor we call coronavirus. And by reminding us, as Seema Yasmin points out, that we are literal cousins of ancient pathogens, wretched offsprings of pandemics, and that far from being exclusively biological matter, viruses are also political events, geographical events, matters of racial justice, spiritual concerns, and social issues. Both Komolaf and Yasmin ask us to, for a measure of humility and a measure of listening to the more than human agency unfolding with and through us. As thinkers and poets who are currently engaged, albeit in very different capacities and milieus, in developing approaches and tools that may enable a lucid and yet compassionate response to the systemic cracks that have emerged from the pandemic, we are confident that both Bayo and Seema tonight will extend our serious goal of activating conversations between people who are already engaged in transforming the infrastructures and cultures of care. So I'm just going to give you a few notes as to how the evening will unfold. Our guest will speak for approximately 20 minutes each. And then it will be followed by a short conversation between them. And then we will open the floor for a Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Professor Alexander Gerson, coordinator of New One at New College, to formally introduce our first guest, Bayo Akomolafe.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here and to welcome everyone and introduce Bayo Akomolafe tonight. Rooted with the Yoruba people in a more than human world, Bayo Akomolafe is the father to Alethea and Kia, the grateful life partner to Ije, son and brother. A widely celebrated international speaker, post-humanist thinker, poet, teacher, public intellectual, essayist, and author of 2 books, These Wilds Beyond Our Fences, Letters to My Daughter on Humanity's Search for Home, and We Will Tell Our Own Story, The Lions of Africa Speak. Bayo Akomolafe is the visionary founders of the Emergence Network and host of the online post-activist course, We Will Dance with Mountains. So help me in welcoming Bayo tonight for this talk.
Thank you so much, my sister. And I greet everyone wherever you are in the world. My name is Baya, as has been eloquently announced. I'm in Chennai, India. It's about 3 a.m. So I love you guys. I really have to love this to be up at this time. I am grateful for the opportunity and the invitation to speak, and most especially to speak with my sister, Seema. I'm just going to take a few moments, because this is all I have at this time, to share some thoughts that might be understood as the spirit of that piece, Elena, that became the iCoronavirus essay, which was planned as a 4,000 word essay, but quickly ballooned to a 20,000 word mini book. I guess I was possessed by something that was more than human. So I would like to speak about that, but not specifically about the book, but the motivations, the instigations, the ideas that have been summoned to make sense of these troubling times. And I speak with the grace of my own people, my family asleep in another room, my ancestors that make this possible and make this place possible. The gods of the glitch that might show up any moment from now. I just greet you effusively. Some of the work that I do is a bringing together of post-humanist thinking, Yoruba indigenous cosmologies. For those of you who don't know who the Yoruba people are, you can consult Google. We're just by the side of Wakanda. Nerd joke, okay? I throw that one all the time. You have to like it. So, you know, I do a reading or an inter-reading, a diffractive reading of post-humanist and post-activist thinking with animism and Yoruba indigenous knowledges. And they inspire me today to rethink this question, or to engage this question that is the altar of our gathering. Who cares? What does it mean to care at this time? I will start with a provocative statement that there is no formulation of well-being and or care that is not already a performance of harm. Maybe it's not that provocative, since most of you are enlightened. But there is no performance of care that does not summon, reinforce, reinscribe performances of harm. And I'll just develop that for a moment. I was reading a book recently. It's a short story. I was reading it again. I love the story. It's written by Herman Melville. You might know him. He wrote the famous novel, Moby Dick, 1851. I think I'm correct, 1851. 4 years later, in 1855, he wrote this short story called Benito Sereno. And it is the story of, narrated by a Captain Amasa Delano, right? An American captain that captains a slave ship that is bound for Massachusetts. Well, the story begins with this slave ship docked at an island called Santa Maria. So it's another watery story, like most of Herman Melville's stories are. Captain Delano notices another ship nearby. I think the St. Dominic or something, that is captained by Don Benito Sereno, the one after whom the story is named. He's the captain of this decrepit, worn out, exhausted slave ship. And Captain Delano finds it within himself to mount that slave ship and put things in order. Except there isn't order aboard this slave ship. You see, everyone is screaming and making noises. Of course, the black bodies are screaming and making noises. And so Captain Delano confronts Captain Sereno, and basically says, man, put your house in order, right? Get everything in order. Look at your slaves just dancing about and making noises. And Sereno's trying to give excuses, basically, talking about why they're doing that. But Delano is livid, right? That you should be able to hold these beings or these animals, put them together, put yourself together, man. Of course, what the storyteller wants us to understand is that, and this is just a summary of the story, because I don't want to spoil it, you see, I would like you to read it. What the storyteller wants us to understand is that hidden in the noise is deep intelligence, code, if you will. It wasn't that the slaves were screaming and doing noisome, cacophonous things that made no sense. It is that they were performing some kind of, it was dramaturgical, almost theatrical, that they were performing a kind of intelligence to masquerade their real attempts to sabotage the slave ship and sail all the way back to Africa. So the account of this American captain was noise, but at a subterranean level, beneath the screaming was deep intelligence, right? It's an exciting book. I invite you to explore it. And this inspires what some authors speak about when they talk about Black geographies, Black outdoors. If you want to understand what that means, I think Catherine McKittrick calls it, this Black geographies, she calls it the subaltern or subterranean alternative patterns of geology that work alongside traditional patterns of geography, not geology. That is to say that place is not just an empty neutral container of bodies. Place is secreted, it's performative, right? It is relational. It rides on the back of bodies in their intensities. It is not even a human thing. Place is emergent and performative. In other words, Black geographies speak about this idea of map making in the hull of the slave ship, right? It speaks about the haunted public. That when you know, a subject of the West or the global North steps outside, you might see beautiful architecture, you might see a beautiful tree in a park, but certain bodies will relate to that place differently. Probably it might be traumatizing to see a tree because it reminds that body of lynchings. So place is never static. Place is intersubjective. Place emerges, place is relational. And the idea of Black outdoors is what I want to premise and centralize here today in our very brief conversation. That is the idea that the public is not as ahistorical or as neutral as we think it is. It is that there are things beneath our attempts to fix the world and get back to normal. That there are things we do not notice when we premise or centralize our regimes of care that are already subsidized by loss and displacement and hidden archetypes and hybrid gods and other things that are rather invisible and hidden and fugitive. If you want to see how that works, let me bring it home, make it a bit more practical. We are in terrifying, anxious-ridden times. We are in moments when we have to ask questions about care and harm, what it means to be well, what it means to get back to normal. These engorged, implosive, inflammatory times are the conditions that give us this place, this altar of our conversation. One way we're responding to it is, you might say, through the cautionary tale of the Antropol Scene. The Antropol Scene is, of course, this, I think, You all know what the Anthropocene is, this geological epoch defined by hyperactive humans in their industrial ventures. The Anthropocene instigates behaviors that are almost salvific or salvation-seeking in their effects. The Anthropocene is this longing to arrive, to address the problems of these moments, to address death and demise. But the problem with the Anthropocene as a place of motivation is that it kind of re-centralizes the human. It kind of re-centralizes humans as the only agential ones in the room, that we're the only ones that are alive and vital and moving in the world. Every other thing around us, including viruses, trees, places, whatever, are dead things, only instrumental to our attempts to move into some colonial or imperial future. And I think that's part of the problem, you see, because when you frame responsivity or accountability using the same epistemology that created the problem, then you deepen your sense of incarceration. And so we are stuck in this toxic cyclicity when we treat the world around us as instrumental to progress, to infinite growth. Then we reiterate our centrality, and that is deeply problematic. So I do not speak about the linearity of cause and effect. I think cause and effect is quite damaging when you get to think about it, but that's another keynote, not today. I hardly speak about the linearity of solutionisms, that this is the problem, all we need to do is fix it, because sometimes the world exceeds our demands for solutions and refuses to be interpolated or hailed or called by our need for solutions in the moment. Some other kind of response is required, demanded. So I often speak about the Afro scene, you see, not the African Anthropocene, but the Afro scene. The Afro scene is, you might think of it as a palimpsest. In textual theory, a palimpsest is this dense coagulation of writing layered and sedimented upon each other, sometimes canceling out each other. It's not meant to be intelligible in a convenient way. I'm trying to say here that history, which is the subject of the Anthropocene, is not neat and tidy. It has screamings of slaves beneath the hull of the modern. It has things that are haunting, bones that have been elided and invisibilized. I'm trying to say the public is haunted, right? The Afro scene, in a nutshell, in a very rude nutshell, and I really hate nutshells, is the invitation to rethink ontology, to break ontology just a little bit, because the surface will not do. The public will not do. We need something else. We need something different. And that leads me, or led me, to examine the ways that a virus is an assemblage, that there is no such thing, so to speak, as this infinitesimally small critter that we rudely call a virus. A virus is a virus plus, right? A virus is a virus and then some, if you will. A virus is an assemblage that is already theological, that is already political, that is already gastronomical, right? It is performative. It is this ferment of bodies in their secretions of realities. When we try to reduce, for instance, climate change to the emission of greenhouse gases, we miss the point that our bodies are weathering bodies, that we are part of this whole thing we're trying to examine with data, right? So beyond the violence of data, what do we see in the hidden public beneath the hull of the slave ship? We notice that viruses are sticky networks of acting. A virus is a practice. I love the way Seema puts it when she asks whether viruses are gods. Right? So I explored in that text this idea of the virus as a trickster, the dehiscence, the opening of the modern, right? Maybe what activists have been praying for, but do not realize that we actually need at this point in time. I remember the book, The Brothers Karamazov, and a proverb in that book about the capturing of the Messiah. And sometimes we incarcerate ourselves within and shackle ourselves to epistemologies that no longer serve. So the Afro scene is this invitation to rethink the virus, not as an external, reductionistic, tiny thing that is amenable to war, or which we can defeat if we just vaccinate ourselves enough, but the perpetuation of this terrain, this territory of the human, which is the imperial space of acting that the modern is premised on. So what I try to do, and this is to cap it all, to put a final point on it, if you will, is to speak about making sanctuary. My work revolves around new geometries of care that I think about as making sanctuary. And I cannot really, within the time that we have, maybe I'll explore it with Seema in conversation, speak about how this emerges from, the practices of the medieval times of claiming sanctuary, and how it relates to the fugitive and becoming fugitive. But I will say this, I have a son who is autistic on the spectrum. We don't usually use that term. I'm a psychologist, a recovering one. We don't use the term autistic in our home. We use a different way to relate ourselves, to posture ourselves to my dear 4-year-old boy. Anytime I demand that he look at me, in my times of frustration, this is a vulnerable confession, he refuses to. He turns away. It was only later on that I learned that because he did not meet me eye to eye, didn't mean he wasn't engaging me. That the interpersonal is not premised on this notion of meeting in the middle, the clinical gaze, meeting and interlocking in the center. And so he refused to be called, he refused to be named. And I sometimes think of the virus as autistic. It refuses to be named fully. Once we think we had it, it dances into a different variant. Once we think we've named it and nailed it, then it becomes a different ontology, shape-shifting like a trickster on a slave ship. I wanted to name this posture altogether that lies between accountability and apathy. And I called it looking away at. So there are two ways of seeing then, if you will, for our purposes, looking at something or looking away from something. But I think there's a third way, looking away at something, turning one's gaze to the palimpsest instead of the linear highway with which we frame solutionisms, with which we frame our vaccination attempts to fix the problem and get back to normal, get back to the consumerist lifestyle we're used to, get back to the restoration of progress agendas, get back to development. I think there is a way to hack into or break into this colonial enterprise that is called a human. And I think that's what the virus is doing. That is what my son in his neurodivergence or emergence is doing, disturbing my claims to sanity, disturbing my claims to care or well-being, and inviting me into the cracks of ontology to perform new realities, maybe. So my message then, if you want to think of it as that, is the humility that comes with being disabled, with being cracked open by the sacred, is what we as a people need to sit with, or else we run the risk of patching over the crack in order to get back to a normal that didn't serve or doesn't serve. It's like trying to install solar panels on a slave ship. I don't know if that is the politics that I want to be engaged in. We might call it an Afro-pessimism, but I think these times are challenging continuity. It's a break or rupture in continuity, inviting us to rethink what it means to be well. Because I think health and being well is imbricated with and entangled with the troubles we're having in the world today. The wellness that allocates independence and categorically sees us as a part. Maybe one thing that the virus did well was to disturb our independence and help us see that our bodies are performative extensions of each other. So what I term making sanctuary is this aesthetic, this politics of surprise that is about sitting in the cracks and listening to the supposedly cacophonous noise. Because there in that hull of the spaceship is a kind of intelligence that we can only hear when we humble ourselves and come down to earth. And that is my spiel. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
Thank you.
I have so many notes now. Go ahead.
Actually, Roberta, it was for you to to enter.
Yeah, well, that's why I
yes.
started talking, because
I will leave. I will come out. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for this. I actually took a lot of notes, in a very unordinate way, but of course they make sense, right? Because they are unordinate, but they have their own logic. And I'm actually like, I would just put it here before I introduce the next guest, that I was brought to think about a lot of the work of a lot of artists that I've been in touch with in the past few months and throughout the pandemic and throughout many lockdowns. And there's this group of women in working in art and technology and science that I've been engaging with. It's called Fan Meeting, and at a certain point we collected a number of videos that responded to the pandemic, and these videos actually somehow, like some of these videos somehow reflect a little bit on what you just said, and we all together collectively were reading your writing anyway, so I think we were kind of inspired by it. But we had a very similar thought about how the pandemic has unfolded and how the virus is just this very complicated, and you put it very well, trickster. But anyway, this was like my just like initial thought, and I just want to move on to our next speaker, and then we're going to bring them together afterward, and who knows what kind of dialogues will come out. So I would like to bring up actually Tina Choi, Professor Tina Choi, who's the chair of the English department at York University, to introduce our second guest for the evening, Dr. Seema Yasmin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Roberta. I'm really honored to introduce Dr. Seema Yasmin. Dr. Seema Yasmin is an Emmy award-winning journalist, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, a medical doctor, and a Stanford and UCLA professor. She served as an officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service at the CDC and as a science reporter for the Dallas Morning News, and also as a medical analyst for CNN. She's the author of 4 books, and her reporting has appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Wired, Scientific American, and on the BBC, NBC, and other news networks. Dr. Yasmin is the director of the Stanford Health Communication Initiative, and a clinical assistant professor of medicine at Stanford University, as well as a visiting professor of crisis management and communication at UCLA's Anderson School of Management. She trained in journalism at the University of Toronto and in medicine at the University of Cambridge. Her unique combination of expertise as a dually trained physician and storyteller have been called upon by the Vatican, the Presidential Commission for the Study of Bioethical Issues, the Aspen Ideas Festival, the Skoll World Forum, and the White House. And I will turn it over to our distinguished guest, Dr. Seema Yasmin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Choi, for that kind invitation. And thank you to everybody who's put together this event, and especially to Bayo for joining us at 2 a.m., 3 a.m. from my motherland. So it's great to connect with you from there. And I have to say that reading Bayo's essay, I, Coronavirus, Mother, Monster, Activist, and his description of that work as speculative fabulation took me instantly to Dr. Saidiya Hartman's work. She refers to her process as critical fabulation, terminology that she first coined and used in her essay, Venus in Two Acts. And this idea of critical fabulation has been described as a style of creative semi-nonfiction. As someone formerly trained in journalism and in medicine, and in very formal methods of fact-finding, this idea of speculative fabulation and critical fabulation of creative semi-nonfiction not only interests and intrigues me, but enthralls me. I am so excited by it. Dr. Hartman has talked about her thoughts on genre, and something that she has said, especially in the face of criticism about which she approaches archival material, quote unquote, facts and story. In response to that criticism, Dr. Hartman has said, I am so unfaithful to genre, which also reminded me of the poet Safia El-Hilo's quote where she says, what is a genre but the drawing of a line? And I certainly took that approach to writing this book of poems, If God is a Virus, which I'm thrilled that you are teaching and reading. And I started to write these books while on a journalistic assignment. I was deployed to West Africa to cover a viral epidemic, to cover Ebola in 2015. Very much with that journalistic assignment, right? I was covering this story, this historic epidemic for the Dallas Morning News and for Scientific American. I was an analyst for CNN at the time as well. And yet there was so much I was witnessing and especially feeling that I was told explicitly and in less blatant ways that there was no room for that in journalism. So I am thrilled that there are women like Safia El-Hilo and Dr. Saidiya Hartman and people like Bayo who are talking about their unwillingness to be faithful to genre and who are bringing together fact and fiction and talking about creative semi-nonfiction. Because I am more keen to get to the conversation part with Bayo and to be in discussion with all of you, what I'd like to do for my time is actually read some poems, if that's okay with everyone, and perhaps talk a little bit about the process or the thoughts behind some of them. Bayo already alluded to some of the language that I've used, and so I actually wanted to start with one of the poems that is titled If God is a Virus, and there's a series of these that are interspersed throughout the book, so I'll start with this one. If God is a virus, she is a Muslim woman in charge of the remote control and human evolution. 8% of your genome is viral. We are literal cousins of ancient pathogens, wretched offsprings of pandemics. It is why we colonize unsatisfied with commensal living. A virus is your grandmother reincarnate, at home in your bone marrow, watching TV with the remote control wrapped in too much plastic. I dated this girl who said her hijab was a virus, kept the white boys away, only brown girls immune to the hate. We wrap ourselves in aluminium keffiyehs because our scalps are aflame with rage, burning with the heat of 6 sons who became 6 terrible men. That is how your grandmother ended up in your marrow, eating salted watermelon seeds, drinking apple tea, and spitting out dysfunctional white cells. And I'll read one more from that series before I talk a little bit about my approach to thinking about viruses and my previous study of virology. So this is another poem that's called If God is a Virus. Phytoplankton drips down her thick thighs as she stirs a primordial ocean with her toenail. Striped fish slap in God's ankle bracelets. Along the coastline, she drags a tangled seaweed braid. If God is a virus, she is naked. Shed her nucleocapsid when salamanders grew legs. Now she is 2 strands of missense RNA, acid ladders reaching to the heavens. God is in your fever, in your dandruff, between your teeth, crying in the permafrost, massaging her way out of a mammoth's trunk, a bison's tailbone. She is having sex. God is making babies in your tender lymph nodes, giggling when you prod the swollen knots. God is pregnant. Parasitic fetus suppressing white cells. God is an infection. Her incubation period as long as 3 sermons on the Mount. Replication rate amplified by saline, sweat, and fear. A virus gave you a gene called sin, so you could grow placentas. Sin fuses baby to mother, fuses uterus to placenta. A virus blew air inside your drowning baby's pigeon chest. Put some respect on her phospholipid membranes. Watch God's fat molecules shimmer, her flagella undulate. If God is a virus, we are over and over again. Reborn absent pinky toes and coccyx, spines 7 degrees more erect. Praise the holy fevers. Pray for split-brained migraines. So you might be able to tell from some of these poems that viruses have lived in my imagination for decades. I am the daughter of an AIDS activist. When I was in my teens living in London, my mum was a caseworker for people of color living with HIV. And I was a science nerd as a kid. And so I was very fascinated in viruses as slivers of DNA and RNA coddled in fat and sugar on that kind of basic biochemical level. But then my mum brought home these stories and a greater understanding of what viruses meant to humanity and how humans understood and misunderstood viruses. And so the HIV pandemic that we've been living through since the early 1980s, for me, has highlighted so many of our misunderstandings about viruses and the ways that we interact with them. And although I can easily say, like, having cared for people with HIV, having treated a plethora of viruses in patients, that I can say I loathe them, but I also respect them and am fascinated and awed by them. And so as I'm on this journalistic assignment, writing about Ebola in very conventional, reporting ways, I'm also thinking about how we have contended with viruses over the course of humanity. And I was covering Ebola at that time. Obviously, we're living through the COVID-19 pandemic now, but I think it's mostly been HIV that's been on my mind since the 90s, since my fascination with HIV and also my mum's work with people who were living with HIV, and the language of that, the semantics of that was so important to her. So as a young teenager, I was made very aware of this idea of viruses as more than the nucleic acid, fat, phospholipid packet that I could understand. And HIV was explained to me as something that exacerbated homophobia and transphobia and racism. And the people that my mom cared for needed antiretrovirals, but often more urgently, they needed somewhere to live. They needed to not be deported. They needed food and shelter and those basic things. And so that's really informed my reporting, my current research, which looks at the spread of pathogens, but also the spread of information about pathogens. So what I study now, the focus of my scholarly research, is mapping the US, specifically at this point, although I'd love to expand it, to look at the flow of information and to understand information deserts. So areas in which there are communities that lack access to robust local journalism infrastructure, and where disinformation and misinformation and conspiracy theories and hoaxes about disease, about viruses, is more likely to spread. I am fascinated by the stories that we tell ourselves about viruses. And last year in my health and science journalism class, I had some eco-poets visit to talk to my students. And one of them was Professor Camille Dungy, who talked not just about viruses, but about nature in general and about how poets write about the world around us, and talked about revering, understanding, and respecting alternative forms of knowing and what it is that viruses might know. And of course, as a scientist, as well as a poet, I do walk this line of even something as simple or profound as whether viruses are alive or not, right? But writing poems and not just journalistic pieces certainly gave me license. And maybe I should start calling it critical fabulation or speculative fabulation. I haven't given it that language yet, but certainly creative semi-nonfiction to explore the bunk and the BS. To that end, there's a few poems in here that, I mean, maybe they're not poems, maybe they are poems. I guess I get to call them poems. But these are statements and short sentences that I came across in WHO memos from the 80s and 90s. And I came across these while I was writing my first book, The Impatient Dr. Langer, which is about the origins of HIV and the unfolding of the HIV pandemic. The Dr. Langer that the title refers to was my dear mentor, Dr. Joep Langer, who is a Dutch virologist and physician who dedicated his life's work to treating HIV and to eradicating it. He was that ambitious and that impatient, hence the title of the book. And he was sadly killed when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014 and his plane was shot down from the sky. But as I was writing that book and as I was researching him, and he worked at the WHO for a while, I found these memos from WHO officials that fascinated me in terms of the way our thinking about epidemics and the way our thinking about viruses evolves over time. So I'm going to read 3 of these to you. Each one is called WHO said or who said. And the first one is who said in 1983. And this is in quotes. AIDS is being very well taken care of by some of the richest countries in the world where there is the manpower and know-how and where most of the patients are to be found. Who said in 1986, everything is getting worse and worse in AIDS and all of us have been underestimating it. That us is doing a lot of work. And then the final one, who said, we make ourselves very easy targets. That is the problem. I'm happy to read more poems later, but like I said, I'm quite keen to be in conversation with Bayo. So I would love to hand it back to the moderators so they can connect us so that we can have a conversation and also so that we can eventually open it up to all of you to be in discussion with you too. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for allowing me to read poems.
Thank you so much, Seema. Those were your poems are not only speculative fabulations, as you or this drawing of the line, but they're actually thinking poems. They are pushing at some boundaries through those juxtapositions of lines, those moments of experimenting with what Bayo may call the deep intelligence moment of the wilds that are seeking to be heard. I'm actually I wanted to connect the very last poem you read, Seema, we make ourselves easy targets, who said, to the very initial provocation that Bayo made at the very beginning of the conversation, which was about there is no idea of health that isn't at the same time a form of harm. And it seems to me that line by the who that follows on the kind of very, very sort of ironic effects of the 1983 and then the 1986 statements, which to me just immediately came the resonance with the WHO, with the pandemic, with the way the early pandemic, and it's just China, no, and now it suddenly becomes a pandemic. So yes, I'm just going to kind of see if those two last observations, your very initial observation, Bayo, and then Seema's last reference to the WHO, to who, it's then again that interesting condensation that then poetry enables. Yeah, I'm curious to how you see those two things, two statements kind of talking to one another.
Baya, would you like to get us started with that? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
After you, my sister.
I've just been taking up time. You go ahead.
Well, the first thing I'll say is, Seema, you have to send me that book, the poetry. It is beautiful, and
thank you.
I felt my hair stand on end. The idea of God as a virus, of viruses as gods, is just something that I feel motivated to keep on exploring, and I think it's vital in a very powerful way for us to stay with that trouble in these times of pain and suffering. How I'd like to jump into this is through the and see how you respond to this. Is what I said about geometries of harm already entangled with practices of care, right? And I think it's important to notice that that is a formulation in humility. Modernity is the attempt to sterilize the outside, right? It's the attempt to make, is to dispense or dismiss harm finally. So there are some utopian sentiments expressed there. You probably know about this Norse mythology of Freya and her son Baldur. And this is a story of Freya, the goddess, basically receiving prophecy that Baldur is to die. There are gods. I don't know how they die, but that's a story. Baldur is to die. And she basically travels across the length and breadth of the multiple universes and extracts a promise from every single being, saying that you will not harm my son. And every single thing, human, non-human, gives her that promise, except the mistletoe, I think. And Loki, the trickster god, takes the mistletoe and basically kills Baldur with it through the hand of another god. But this idea of trying to extract from the world the promise to feed our rational civilization is modernity's goal. So to think of care as total and complete, a pure archive of practices, is dangerous because it re-centralizes us. I don't know how you dance with that.
Well, I'm glad I pushed you to go first, because that's a really fascinating and macro perspective. And instantly and I reached for the book because there are poems in here that speak to this, but I would say on a more micro level, except it's all the same and it's all connected. And so and I guess because as a physician, I do often think about care and harm in very literal terms, right?
Yes,
like the placing of hands on a person and what healing that can bring and what harm that can bring. And there are poems in here that are not just about Ebola, but are about my experiences, not as a journalist, but before that, my experiences as a carer, as a physician, except not feeling like a carer because of the system in which and the way in which we were expected to deliver care. And so there's a poem that when it took me 10 years to write a particular poem in here that's about an encounter with a patient, and it's so human and it's so real, and it's the things that you really think about when you take care of a patient. But I needed a decade of distance in order to give myself permission that it was okay to write about caring for this person in this way, and what it felt like to care for him in that way, and the way that the system made me feel for wanting to care for him in that. Shall I read it?
Yeah, please.
Actually, because I think then it will make more sense. But I do think that it connects in that macro way too. And yeah, maybe I needed a decade to find some of not just the courage, but the language. But the poem is called Anamnesis. And this is how it goes. My patient is the same age as me, 27. Same complexion, golden brown, same postcode, E8. Chief complaint. Patient presents with 5-week history of intermittent blurred vision, neck pain, headaches, and vomiting. My patient is a DJ. Spins lovers rock, dance hall, sometimes a little bit of house and garage in clubs in Hackney and Essex. Past medical history, unscarred, fine too. Grew up in the end without getting stabbed or shot. Ordinarily, I would ask you for your digits, he says, straightening a pretend collar on his diaphanous white hospital gown. Ordinarily, I think, what a word, what a world. But since we are here, ordinarily, we would meet somewhere near the DJ booth. Who am I kidding? We'd meet behind it. Ordinarily, I would let you drape your arm around my neck. Ordinarily, we would dance to a Beres Hammond tune and hold hands. Family history. Ordinarily, he would live to 87 like his grandpops, the one in Kingston, the one on his mum's side, the one who Amber Rudd sent back on a reverse windrush, but said he went of his own volition, said he would not be buried in dirt that could not sprout mango trees. I drape my stethoscope around my neck, fiddle with the diaphragm, finger the metal bell, scroll up and down the CT scan. Up and down, we wait. Family history. His mother loves him. She loves him so, so much. Right now, she is driving through the congestion zone to find out what is wrong with her baby boy. Why did he wind up in accident and emergency on a Tuesday morning? We wait for his mother, and when she walks onto the ward, I say the thing, a 5-syllable thing, and she collapses onto my pinafore. Brown goddess locks spill onto my face, over my right shoulder, and from his bed, he says, "Mum, Mum." So I too say, "Mum, Mum." In the doctor's lounge, I brew tea because this is what we do. Brits, doctors at times of crisis. War, divorce, brain tumors in brains as young as our own. His mum collapsed on me, I tell another doctor, like on me. I sip tea because this is what we do. You look sad, the male doctor says, stirring. Then, perhaps you're not cut out for this job, not cut out for clinical medicine. Perhaps you're not cut out for this job, you fucking robot, I say, but not really. Really, I sip tea because this is what we do when the world is ending and there is to be no more ordinarily. And so I've been thinking a lot about that because I felt like a failure as a carer in that system and did not have language for it in 2000. When was that encounter take place? 2009, right? So when I first qualified. And now, of course, and especially in the pandemic, but even before, we've been talking about moral injury. We've been talking about burnout. We've been talking about the systemic issues that prevent physicians from care and healthcare workers from caring well for our patients, but also thriving ourselves and surviving ourselves. So that's what your remarks earlier and just now made me think of in terms of geometries of harm entangled with practices of care.
Beautiful. I'm intrigued by because it's not every day you come across poetry intersecting with medicine and the practice. I like how it unarranges or disarranges those hard physical phallic lines with which we describe care, right?
Yeah.
Disturbs it so that it becomes something else. And I think we need to do that. I don't know why you're speaking about critical fabulation as something to come. This is critical fabulation. This is speculative fabulation, disturbing those hard, rigid lines of care. And just to bring it home a bit, we need to think and speak and write like this especially in times of crisis. I often say that in times of upheavals, what you need is not precision. You need, or to get to the point, you need to be beside the point. And poetry, poetry is that which allows us to sit beside the point in ecstasy. A very powerful example of what you're saying and what I'm saying is I was reading this article about HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, which are these gases that are used in refrigeration, in aerosols, air conditioning, and quite critically for our conversation, were very much used for vaccines, right? To contain and refrigerate vaccines. And HFCs, as they're called, are 150 to 5,000 times more potent than carbon, right? And have a more, a longer atmospheric life than carbon dioxide. I'm just thinking about how our attempt to fix the crisis reiterated the crisis, right? Our attempts to get ourselves back to normal was already implicitly a quotidian form of violence.
Totally,
right?
because also normal was violent, normal was
Yes,
inequitable,
yes,
right?
yes.
Normal was broken. And I think especially as a very public commentator early on in the pandemic, especially in March of 2020, the question I got asked most was, so how many days will lockdown last for? And Dr. Yasmin, when will things go back to normal? And obviously the epidemiologist part of me is thinking, well, historically, I mean, the flu pandemic of 1918, you could argue it was 5 or 6 years before there was some return to systems that people recognized. Some, it took that long for there to be a return to a way of life people recognize. But also, fuck normal. Who wants to go back to normal, right? Normal was immunocompromised and chronically disabled people being sidelined and ignored and erased, which we've actually just seen worsened during the pandemic.
Right.
Normal was the set of systems and conditions and brokenness that got us to a pandemic of which we are now in year 3 of a pandemic that possibly could have been contained early on. Like that was what normal did. Why does anybody want to go back to that? And I guess that some people want to go back to it because they lived very well in that normal. And many didn't,
And normal produced this. Normal gave us this pandemic and will probably birth other crises of this kind, which is the reason I often like to situate the slave ship as a political constituent of our times, right? It's not just speculative fabulation. It's the idea that these transatlantic middles, these horrific, events that lie beneath the veneer of normalcy, of the modern, as cracks open up in the modern, I think our work is to situate care within the crack and not to patch it up with a Band-Aid and rush back to the familiar, which is dangerous and risky.
Yeah, and also the things that you're talking about are not that historical. They're not that far back.
No.
The capitalist structures, the way we bank is completely informed by chattel slavery, especially if you're living in the US like I am, or grew up in the UK like I did. Our relationship with sugar, even, things as quotidian as that, the sugar that we all stir into our PG tips every morning. There's a direct line between that and slavery, and a very convenient way we have of not contending with those things.
Right. So I mean, and Seema and I need 2 more hours. Are you guys, everyone okay with that? 2 more hours? Yeah. There's this. So I guess this might be a way to introduce the idea of harm reduction.
Yes.
Harm reduction, right? Maybe we can speak about that a little. Malcolm X.
You're talking to a public health physician, like that's our language, right? We never talk about anything as being safe. We'll slap your hand if you say safe without adding an R to the end. It's safer.
Safer.
Right.
Right.
But what comes to mind for you when you think about harm reduction in this context?
Malcolm X.
Oh,
There was something he said in response to a question during an interview. Can't remember the exact thing, but I think he was asked, so are you happy with the progress being made in terms of racial relations and justice? And I'm like, no, I'm not happy about some progress. There's no progress being made. If you stick a 9-inch knife in my spine, in my back, and you remove the knife by 3 inches, that's not progress. If you remove the knife by 7 inches, that's not progress. That sometimes you don't even acknowledge that there's a knife there. When I think of harm reduction, I think about again the slave ship and a crack appearing in the slave ship and the operators of the slave ship screaming, "All hands on deck," because we need to save the slave ship or we all die, you see. So let's patch this crack. And I'm thinking of the slaves thinking, right? Patching this crack is continuing the violence of my incarceration. So what do? This is why I think the Antropol Scene is pulled into some deeper gravity, and we need a different field of responsivity that is not about saving ourselves, but it's about responding to this God as virus aesthetic, this thing that exceeds us, that Rilke would say, we need to be defeated by again and again. And that might be shocking to people listening to us.
right. Or not, because one quick thing I want to say is that you make me think about mutual aid and how mutual aid, this idea of community level organizing and neighbors looking after each other and not relying on broken systems to do that work, were really highlighted in the early days of the pandemic. So we saw that approach to care and that approach to moving away from systems that purportedly care but actually harm. But the other thing, what you say makes me think of is this idea that comes up again and again historically and in modern day times too, which is, when a pandemic happens, when a Trump gets elected, when a famine occurs, when there is revolution, it's a burning it down to the ground, it's a raise it down to the ground, and from there we can build up something. And so I remember when Trump was elected, there were people like, well, maybe we needed this. Maybe this will just bring all the underlying, it was not underlying, but people said it will bring all the underlying racism to the fore and finally we'll be able to address it. Now this shows that things are so broken. This pandemic has ravaged the planet for 3 years. We can almost start over. What do you say to that?
I think some thinkers or some texts think of that as accelerationism, like accelerationism. Like if we live into the nuances of capitalism, that we speed up its death. If we raise everything to the ground, then we can start all over again. I don't trust those notions of starting all over again. But again, I think that there's a dense middle that is often forgotten when we binarize accountability, or we think of accountability and responding to a crisis like the pandemic is, as at the end of one spectrum, and the other end of the spectrum is laziness, apathy, ignorance. When we think of things in those dualistic ways, then we lose sight of the dense middle and intelligences that are possible. I wouldn't even frame it as mutual aid, right? I wouldn't frame it as mutual aid at all. I would think of it as just ways of being in the world that call upon or queer our notions of well-being and being in community and being well fed and eating and drinking well.
So then let me put this to you, because if we make it really granular, right? And if we say, well, okay, let's not think about the planetary level, but let's think about how broken the healthcare system is in the US, for example. Let's think about how there's an epidemic of burnout, how there's poor patient care, how there's issues around accessibility and affordability. And sometimes I think there's an element of hopelessness when people say, well, how do we fix this? And you want the element of hopelessness is let's burn it to the ground and let's start again. Like it's so broken. We just have to raise it and raise it again. So if I make that more granular, more tangible an example, what's your take on that?
On raising things to the ground, burning things to the ground and starting all over again.
That as sometimes a I think, perhaps a hopeless approach to trying to fix a system that's supposed to care, but often does harm instead of care. And that those of us in it, that includes patients too, feel like it's an intractable problem. How do we fix it while it functions as it is or is dysfunctional?
I think there's an invitation to think in two registers here. I will never dismiss even systems, because I think systems do not remain faithful entirely to their motivations. That even healthcare practices that might reinforce harm are also fugitive. They're also becoming something different, right? So I would never dismiss that and say it's evil and this is good. That's too clean a system, or that's too convenient a way of thinking about these matters. But I'm so given to the idea that there are yet to be intelligible practices or ways of being in the world that disturb the centrality of our care systems, and that we need to sit and listen, whether in community, whether in ritual. And until we do that, we will not know how to move out of the mess we're in, because we are stuck, like I said. It's this repeatability that I'm trying to critique here.
Yeah, and as you say that, I do wonder what lessons we can learn from viruses,
right?
In terms of mutations and variations and iterations and
there
testing out fitness. And there's a series of poems in the book that are written by a virus, and they are
really
poems that are a virus writing a self-help book for humans. You know, it's another, like Camille Dungy says, it's another way of knowing, it's another intelligence.
Yes,
But sometimes is at odds with ours, or sometimes is at odds with our survival and well-being, but oftentimes isn't. And like I write in that poem, you know, 8% or some say up to 12% of our genome is viral, the remnants of ancestral viruses. And so I wonder, you know, as we center humans so much, what intelligences are sidelined and therefore missed, and how do we decentralize?
How do we decenter? You know, when the pandemic broke open, the chalice, and became what it is today, a man and a group of people in Kerala, I'm sure you know Kerala, here in India, mounted up an altar to the Corona goddess.
Yeah.
Did you hear that story? Did you know that story?
Ago. Yes, it rings a bell.
To the Corona goddess. And these people were basically trolled and abused as backward thinking, primitive people, that this is not how to think about this situation. We need to think about it in this particular way. And I thought something is lost here. His response was very much like yours. You know, he said, if God is everywhere, then God is a virus as well. You know, but it was lost on the people, on the journalists that were thinking about this. The intelligences you speak of, this is what Earl Lovelace, the Trinidadian novelist, will speak of as bacchanal aesthetics. And some of the writers in his tribe would speak about the slave routes and hidden methodologies that were practiced beneath the noses of their masters, right? Hidden medical practices. I read of this account of, I forget the disease, and their experiments with a certain plant. Damn it, maybe it's my 3:55 a.m. brain, because I know this, but it's gone. But these the healthcare regime of that time looked down upon this, that this is rubbish, this doesn't work. And I think the man that they caught with it was whipped and flogged to death, right? For using this plant to address this ailment. And then they practiced it. They decided to adopt it, and it became part of medical culture. But it came from slaves in their experimentation with the world. And I think there we have it. That's a model, if you will, that we must appropriate. That there are hidden technologies, hidden meanings, hidden significations, hidden intelligences that we need to sit with. And this will invite failure. This is not a sure approach. This is not a guarantee for safety, but it's an invitation to risk playing with the world that we thought we left behind when we framed healthcare as independence.
I mean, there's a whole parallel there with the way that vaccines were invented and how that
Yes.
knowledge arose apparently in, the English colonies in the US, in what we now know as Boston, but it was an enslaved man, right, called Onesimus, who was
I don't know this.
Yeah, it's a really interesting history. There were so many smallpox outbreaks then, but he knew about this technology from back home before he was enslaved, where pus was taken and put onto a thorn and people were inoculated. And at first he was ridiculed and nobody listened, of course. And then this idea was taken and we ended up with vaccines based on that science. And I think perhaps in Turkey at the same time, similar things were also being used.
That is impressive.
Yeah, and then those technologies were taken to Europe and then of course to the colonies here in the United States as well.
I would love to have that reference so I could explore further.
Yeah, I'll look that up for you. I can share that with you.
Okay, but that is, I guess, the heart of, I think, the glowing data point in our conversation is this, that we cannot risk, dare I say it, we cannot risk being well. that if wellness is connected with the perpetuity and the continuity of the slave ship, then we need to find alternatives to a colonial way of being well. That wellness has to be hacked and broken through. And it's only the non-human, the more than human, the agencies of the virus and the molecular that can break through our performances of well-being.
What might that decolonized wellness look like? When you imagine that, what do you see or feel?
I think it might look like, among many other things, a peace or a comfort with demise.
Oh, that seems at odds with Western medical practice, at least, where often we so fail at end of life care. I feel like I failed patients at end of life care, and we are so hard-headed about extending life by weeks or days at the expense of any kind of quality of life. We're not okay with demise.
No, we're not. We're not okay with grieving. We're not okay with demise. I as a recovering psychologist, shrink, want you to be productive. I'm a policeman of capitalism. I want you to get back into the rat race. I want you to do well. And I think there is that part of what it means to be entangled in the world is to also risk dehiscence, is to also risk ontological expansion and wounding. That if we were so packaged together, if we were all that, if we risk being complete, if we risk being fully intelligible, then we are subjugated, then we're lost in a performance of stability and presence. But until we stick with the absences that are haunting us, then yeah.
I mean, there's an ICD-10 code for grief, right? Because we pathologize a very inhuman response to life, to living, to being human, to being alive. We have labeled that and pathologized that and given it a billable code because it's something that needs treating.
Yes. Elena, come on, what are you doing? You want to go on.
Well, I also have some very, very engaged audience that is really itching to jump in and to ask questions. And I've actually have been corresponding with Nubeze Philip, who is here, and I'm hoping that she can be spotlighted soon because she's asked a question, and I asked her if she wanted to come in person. So there you are, Nubeze. So I'll let you speak then.
Thank you both for a wonderful presentation. And just to follow up on what, may I call you Bayo?
Yes.
What Bayo said about, Dr. Seema, is it?
Seema, you call me Seema, yes.
Call you Seema? Okay, you talked about smallpox. In Trinidad, the Orisha, the Yoruba Orisha god is Shakpana, the god of smallpox. Yeah. And there is in Cuba, he's called Babalu Aye.
Babalu
Aye, and it was a very powerful Orisha in Nigeria, Sopona or Shakpana, and it was all about small. Yeah, and they understood vaccinations before the West, actually, because the priest would scrape the skin, and they believed the priests were infecting the people and so on. It's really worth researching. It's quite fascinating. But my question has to do with critical fabulations. And I was wondering how both of you and the audience as well would, we've all lived during the pandemic with the various conspiracy theories and so on. And I don't want to dismiss those who were opposed to vaccination, holus bolus, but would you see that as a form of critical fabulation as well in the, another manifestation of it, in that, there's some factual evidence, but then, we have the QAnoners who believe, all number of things. We have those who believed other conspiracies, even spreading to the Ukrainian war, where I saw, I don't know if you saw it, Elena, in the Toronto Star last week, there is an amazing correlation between those people who were anti-vaxxers and those who were supporting the West in the war with Ukraine's war with Russia right now. So those who were in favor of vaccinations were most in support of
Ukraine,
the West helping Ukraine.
Yes.
Those who were opposed to vaccinations were also opposed to any giving help to Ukraine, and it's quite fascinating. And in fact, I have had a healthcare person, a bodywork person, who said to me that what was happening in Ukraine was all a conspiracy. When I spoke to her about cities being destroyed, she said, "Oh, do you really believe that?" And those kinds of questions. So I'm really I know Saidiya's work and so on, but I'm really interested in that parallel between this wonderful manifestation of dealing with archives, but also this this idea of now that fact-based reporting is under, and Seema, you were also a journalist. I saw something last week, I'll just say this and end, on YouTube by Dr. John Campbell from England, who's been reporting, giving these half-hour presentations on the virus. And the most recent one I saw, he talked about a BMJ, the British Medical Journal article, that is raised the problem of evidence-based medicine being no longer seen as trustworthy because the pharmaceuticals are so tied to healing or unhealing, so to speak. So I just thought, that sort of container of critical fabulation, and we're sort of living with a manifestation of critical fabulations as well. So if you could talk to that, I'd be really interested.
Would you like to go, Seema?
I'll try and be brief because I want to hear your thoughts on this, but this is something I've studied for a decade, and I've written a book about this called Viral BS, Medical Myths and Why We Fall for Them. And it starts off with my confession that I grew up a conspiracy theorist, and that conspiracy theories really made sense in my immigrant Muslim community in the UK, where we dealt with Islamophobia and xenophobia and sometimes these absurd stories. about the royal family, for example. They were a way of connecting ourselves with each other. And those things that sounded absurd and like conspiracies made sense because we grew up being told by our family that at one point, the 1 in 4 humans was a subject of the British Empire. And that sounded fake, but that was true. And so as I debunk a lot of myths, and especially around anti-vaccines and anti-mask movements, I think a lot about my own upbringing and why it was that conspiracy theories were so important to us and so believable to us and so compelling. As I have, and the Ukraine stuff doesn't surprise me because as I've tracked more anti-science sentiments over the last decade, what I've seen is, yes, there's always messaging that is about the vaccine and what's inside the vial and the chemicals and the ingredients. But increasingly, I think, what I see more and more is anti-vaccine messaging that's about everything outside of the vial. So for example, messaging now that will say vaccines are anti-American. If you get vaccinated, it means you're anti-freedom. If you wear a mask, it means you're against the American way of life. So of course, these ideologies are completely connected, and it's complicated and layered and nuanced in a way that we currently practice medicine is not equipped to deal with. We are not equipped to have those conversations. All we do is pull out a pamphlet that has 10-syllable ingredients in the vaccine, and we tell you they're safe based on evidence. And of course, I am someone who's a public health doctor. Vaccines are almost our religion. And yet I'm surrounded by loved ones, really close loved ones, who refuse to get vaccinated for COVID, for other things. It completely makes sense to me, even as I am trained in evidence-based medicine. I think about, where does our evidence come from? I mean, our textbooks are sometimes based on photos and data that were taken from vulnerable people purposefully infected with things. So you want to talk about fact? Well, then can we talk about the provenance of fact? If you want to talk about evidence, can we talk about the provenance of evidence and who was harmed in order for us to understand the natural history of gonorrhea? Well, it was commercial sex workers and incarcerated people in Guatemala, for example. So there's all this dirty history and all these bloody inequities over centuries that land us where we are now with this, passion around evidence-based medicine without us willing to unpack where that came from or why there are wide, seemingly insurmountable chasms between those of us spewing the evidence and the people saying, no, you will not put that needle in my arm. Like I said, I've written a book about this, and I've just written another one that's aimed just at young people, which comes out in September, called What the Fact, which does the same thing as trying to get young people to think critically about what even is a fact before we think about what we even going to believe. But I'll leave it there because Baya, I would love to hear your take on this.
Viral BS, it's called. Is that what you call it?
That's the book that came out a couple of years ago. Yeah.
I'll check it out. Thanks, sister. Auntie, I think Seema has held a very core aspect of how I might respond to this. But to respond to the critical fabulation aspect of this first, it's one thing I want to center here on privilege is the idea that history is not neat or straight or tidy, right? History is already an occlusion of things that happened, right? So the historical account and the imperialism of fact, right? And this is not to take away, this is not to dismiss fact, but it's to say that fact itself is subsidized by the hidden or by the invisible. And so critical fabulations speak about lives, stolen lives, displacements that exceed history, that in order to enact a decolonial emancipatory politics, we need to go beyond history. We need to enact imagination, or we need to perform errant, fugitive imaginations that do things with the world that exceed what has been accounted for, right? And so it's with this, with this invitation that I gave a keynote last year at the New School on the surprising gift of stupidity. And my spiel was that we often frame stupidity as being impervious to data, to knowledge, right? It's something cognitive. What is lost in that framing, deeply psychological, is that what we often call stupidity is embeddedness and being nested in certain ecologies that enact trust and distrust simultaneously. That what it means to be a Black body from Nigeria is not entirely characterizable by what is within me, for instance. It is the ecologies that I live in, that I inhabit, that create the cognitive moves that I make in the world. So that stupidity is political, stupidity is ecological. An experiment, field of experiments called epistemic situationism supports the idea that furniture around us actually shape how we think about the world, right? The texture, the colors around us shape how we meet the world and understand the world around us. So it's not left to us to frame stupidity as something within the human. And maybe my point here then is maybe what we call vaccine hesitancy is not just a repudiation of the data as much as it might also be a performance of ecologies and the Antropol Scene playing itself out. That the world is not flat, it's unbalanced, and there are regimes of thinking and ecologies of trust. And to insist that everyone receive some information in the same way and it lands in their bodies in the same way is to categorically think of bodies as monolithic. And so we're missing something here. I think that the invitation to think of stupidity as a form of critical fabulation is provocative, but yet I think that is something I would hear and something I would actually celebrate, that people in the villages where I come from who say, no, you're not going to stick that in me, are not just dismissing fact. They're embedded in their worlds in particular ways that may not be visible to the surface of things. And I think that is something, quite interesting to explore even further.
If I can add one final thought to that, it's a quote from Dr. Sadiya Hartman. She says, fact is simply fiction endorsed with state power. Right.
That the world isn't made up of already determinable things that we call facts, that the world is wild in its emergence. And to reduce it to object and subject, the Euclidean Cartesian paradigm of thinking about the world as already outside of us, while diminishing the ways that we meet the world and how that produces what we call facts, is to perpetuate a regime of the master. And I think our work is to escape this plantation. And so it's just that the politics of today hijacks these explorations within a very sickening binary. What you highlighted as the left and the right leaning into certain traditions and leaning into certain convictions. But it's more than that. It's more than that. There's something else here.
I don't know if I can jump in. Just I'm gonna exercise my privileges as one of the moderators. But when you pronounce, so there's two keywords that keep coming back to me, and one is what you just described as the ecology of trust, and thanks Norbize for picking up the discourse, because it's very key. So the ecology of trust, and also what you said before, looking away at something, right?
Right.
And I was also thinking about what Seema was talking about when she was relating to her practice as a medical practitioner, and so I'm one of the people who participated in our roundtables, in our past roundtables, is a philosopher. Her name is Maria Antonia Gonzalez Valerio, and she was reflecting on triage as for a very, very like cruel form of choice of cure, right? And who gets to be cured and who gets treatment and who does not. And
Right.
And I had a conversation with her, and we were talking about, and I think that this can be extended to the entirety of society. In a sense, our system is so intent in competing with each other that even what Seema called the community of like a mutual aid, and become almost impossible to be established because of this complete competition between the parties, where even so when you're already a vulnerable person, you end up competing with another vulnerable person. Yeah. And I find that this is and I want to bring this back to like burning everything to the ground. So when we don't have anything anymore, how do we raise from the ashes? But what I was very interested in was this contradictions that we are faced with, right? So on the one hand, we are thinking, oh, let's embrace this idea of viruses, and let's interact with them in a more holistic way. And on the other hand, we are taken by protecting ourselves from the viruses. And at that point, science is very key to it. So I'm wondering if you can address this contradiction, both of you, in some way.
Yeah, I wonder why it has to be a contradiction. Like, are the two things mutually exclusive?
Exclusive. Right.
Well, it's. I don't think the two things are exclusive, but what I see happening becomes mutually exclusive. Right. So I'm wondering what, like, if we are stuck and what we need in order to be unstuck.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of all comes back to capitalism for me in a way. Even this, the ethicist or philosopher's perspective on triage is so interesting, because the way you're taught triage and the way that triage becomes this ingrained knowing, you can look at people and realize who is sick and who there is an act of prioritization. The way you describe it is really interesting, because it makes me think about the scarcity mindset and the fact that there isn't enough time and enough resources and enough care for everybody, which makes me think also about the earlier conversation Bayo and I had about the connection to productivity, and therefore the connection to a capitalist way of healthcare, of loving even, right? Because it certainly affects that too. But then I think, and I've written capital letters and underlined the word fabulation as you were talking, because it's going to take a radical reimagining, right? And I think about something that the author and activist Mariame Makabe says about hope as a practice, and about imagination, and which also is something that Octavia E. Butler encouraged us to do, this idea that the way things exist isn't a natural order of being. It was a figment of somebody's imagination. And actually the way things are probably does serve, we know it serves some people. Billionaires exist amongst us. I used to live in Silicon Valley. I was neighbors with some of them. The world is pretty cool for them. But if we want a reimagining that is equitable, that is more caring, then that does take imagination. It does take fabulation. It does take Dr. Hartman's idea of remembering fact is simply fiction endorsed with state power, which, if you look at it that way, disrupts everything. So for me, it comes back to the practice of fabulation, the practice of imagination and hope.
The way I would dance with this is, I mean, triage is already evidence that a clean bill of health is no less ideological than a religious text, right? that just to see, and I mean, triage can actually be read together with technologies of racialization. That the ways that we understand well-being and who gets the urgency of treatment is already caught up in computational capitalisms and deep troubles that are endemic to modernity. So I don't actually see this as contradictory. I see this maybe paradoxical, but I see that the moves we have to make in the world today are not as clean cut as dismissing, right? Or dismissing one and jumping into the other, that the world doesn't work that way. New conditions of possibility emerge for different supplementary kinds of politics, if you will. Deleuze might speak of it as a politics of going invisible, imperceptibility, right? And I think that idea of going under and descending into the subterranean, in practice, that might look like a Caroline priest speaking about God as a virus and the ethnographies that emerge from that kind of admission. That might invite us to sit with that. And then maybe our eyes and our ears and our senses might be alive to the world in new ways that gives birth to new health paradigms, right? But it'll start with a rearrangement. This is not human work, right? This is ecological shape-shifting trickster work. It will start with networks suffering upheavals, which is the agency of the monster, you see, and the agency of the virus disrupting the fabric of continuity. It'll start with this eruption, this upheaval, blackness extended. And then our eyes can see new shit. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen are not here, so I could say words like shit. It'll start with us seeing and perceiving differently, but we need a resensitization to get there.
I'm really glad that triage came up in this, because we didn't have to, base the conversation around that exactly, but it did make me think about how much BS is ingrained in the way that we triage. There's a poem in my book related to it, but I will tell you that even the way that I, as a medical student, understood the symptoms of a heart attack, for example, and could stand in an emergency room to be like, this person is in an acute cardiac crisis, this person is not. Those were the symptoms of a male body having generally a heart attack, right? So that was the typical presentation, and everything atypical was what didn't not happen to somebody in a white cis male body.
Right.
Wild.
Right. There you go.
Yeah, no, this could really go on for a very, very long time, and I'm just in awe of everything that has come up so far. I had wanted to point out exactly like Roberta mentioned earlier, this idea of ecologies of trust, because that the question of conspiracy theories, the question of the way information travels, the way it has that same kind of contagious idea that accrues to the viruses. They stick. These pieces of information stick and then grow in certain ways, indeed, according to those ecologies of trust that are mostly about, how do you figure out your sense of belonging, right? Your sense of who's your tribe, right? Who's the ones you belong to, and hence then a whole patterning of behaviors then that emerge around that. And I think, yes, today in the end of modernity, of the last gasps of modernity, we're witnessing also the crumbling of state structures, like of the nation state and all those things, at the same time as we're witnessing their kind of attempt at extreme consolidation, like all these really, really kind of radical ideologies of nationalism that are, and I think, you know, the whole mask, anti-masking are still sort of part and parcel. Sometimes they align with those, as Nubeze was mentioning, they align with that. So thinking of, and I think there is something very, very myopic around, and it did came up from our roundtables around the way science continues to present itself as a universal kind of messaging, and
Yes,
not
indeed.
and not a situated messaging that has its own particular history. And that's a very that's a colonial episteme, right? And it doesn't necessarily actually compute with the actual practices of scientists, but and in their everyday, right? Because there are situated relations there, but it is now kind of that kind of messaging of the voice from nowhere that is the science, that is the one you should trust because it's above everything. That's something that we really need to question, not to go into conspiracy theories, but to go into a more nuanced kind of relation to understanding just how much of our everyday behaviors are really oriented by those ecologies of trust, by those sense of, you know, who are the communities of reference that in different ways we assume that we are part of, and hence also who are our so-called enemies or non-enemies or foreign to us. So recently I was reading about the Care Manifesto, this book. I don't know if you can see it. Written by a collective in the UK, just in 2020, just published, and on the politics of interdependence. And there's a very strong emphasis in this book, in this little booklet, on cultivating an ethics of caring for the stranger. And, you know, they bring up all kinds of different kinship communities, all kinds of different practices that even through promiscuous care, through the AIDS activist moment, a whole set of moments. But this idea of the caring for the stranger, that might be indeed that moment of opening, you know, where that ecology of trust can actually move towards something that is not necessarily exactly like you, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it might be telling you something else. I'm not.
Right.
In the interest of time, can I just say really quickly, I've just shared a link in the chat, because what you're saying is the believe in science became a very strange end goal during the pandemic, just believe in science. And I think in my frustration when the vaccine first came out and uptake was, I may have said the same thing, like just follow the science. But it was a really strange thing to say, a really strange end goal, and a very non-critical thinking sentiment to foster. The article that I've shared in the chat is a paper that shows that people who said, I believe in science, were more likely to fall for pseudoscience and more likely to transmit false information about science to other people.
Interesting.
Right. So critical thinking over this trust in science, voice from nowhere, because really it's a voice from somewhere, and it's usually a white man's voice.
Yeah, the captain trying to put order on the ship, right?
Yeah.
As Bayo was saying with Melville's story. I'm going to invite Roberta back online, because I see it is 7:01, and I know that Bayo would love to go to sleep. And thank you so much for this wonderful wonderful conversation. Thank you, Seema. Thank you, Bayo. I don't know what else to add. Lots to think about, lots to kind of keep working at. I'll just sort of pass it on to Roberta. Thank you to everyone who's been here. But Roberta, I'll leave you to the final words.
Oh, the final words. Oh my God, this is like a lot.
I would say, can we please do it again and in person?
Yes.
This is what I was saying.
With
I
ice
was
cream.
about to say, this is what I was about to say, that this is such a enriching conversation, and I'm actually brought back to all the guests that we've had so far. And if you have a chance, just look them up on our YouTube channel. Apparently, we had more people watching after the fact than people actually attending, because of various reasons, because of COVID, because of like people's busy life, etc., because we are also a little bit tired of looking at each other's through a screen, etc. But I really hope that we could really bring this back all together in a more I don't know, physical body.
Now that you've said it during a live stream, you have to make it happen. That's the rule.
I mean, we might be able to. I mean, like
Yes.
So far we've had quite some. We were given trust to do this, so like I really hope this is gonna happen. So to more meetings.
Thank you so much. This is
Yeah.
Done in person.
Thank you, Bayo.
Yes.
I am so grateful. Thank you, my dear sister.
Thank you so
Seema.
much.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you all,
Thank you.
and yes, hopefully in person soon.
Inshallah. Take care.
Yes.
everybody.
Inshallah.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye.